Welcome again to Cornish Talks Common Sense. We're back with another show today, and today is another challenging topic. And if you followed our programming, you'll know that I've not been shy about tackling difficult topics. And I want to do that again today. And so we're going to spend some time talking about the subject of multiculturalism. What is multiculturalism? How does it operate in the world today? And how does it operate in Canada? Come right back and we'll talk about that in just 1 minute. Welcome back. So, as indicated, we're going to talk today about the subject of multiculturalism. What is multiculturalism? As is the case for many words in language, sometimes defining something is not as easy as one may think. Multiculturalism is probably one of those terms that falls into that category, but I'm going to attempt to elucidate and elaborate on the topic a little bit for you today so that we can gain a greater understanding of what multiculturalism portends and how it's affecting the direction of our world today. So I want to start by just noting that the zeitgeist of our modern age, the spirit that sort of dominates the thinking of our modern age, has shifted dramatically in recent years to aggressively promoting this trend of multiculturalism. And the idea really is to dilute an emphasis on nationalism and even more so to be directed towards what ultimately is really a new world order, the idea even of ultimate world governance. So you have to understand multiculturalism through this broader historical and ideological lens. And I'm going to try to shed some light on that for you today. So what we're finding then is in our modern world, we're seeing a movement by many elites, governmental and academic and in the business world, to generate this multicultural context. And so, for example, if we look at the European Union, we see that as a quintessential example. So we find the amalgamated countries in the European Union, now absent Great Britain, as minimizing borders, effectively getting rid of borders in Europe so that countries who are members of the European Union can travel quite freely across borders of all the European countries. And so the effect of it is it's reducing the sense of nationalism. And although European countries individually still have national governments, it's watered down very substantially by the linkage with the European Union and the European Parliament and governance out of Brussels, Belgium, and all of the attenuant organizations of the European Union that work together toward promoting the European Union as the force of governance for all of those different nationalities and ethnicities that exist in Europe. And of course, we know that after Brexit, Great Britain extricated itself from that political organization. And of course, it was roundly criticized for that, and it was said, well, the economy of Great Britain will falter because of it. And indeed, and probably not surprisingly, its economy has suffered somewhat. But I think the important thing that people miss is that Great Britain now has its own independent governance. They are subject to the laws of the British Parliament and not to a European Parliament and a larger organization that does not necessarily follow the best principles and best interests of Great Britain. So the remarks against Great Britain withdrawing from the European Union, I think, have been overstated substantially. So what is happening then in the European Union? Well, we've seen in recent years some great difficulties that have arisen in Europe with the advent of freely moving immigration between the European countries. And so I have a book with me today. It's called White Shift, and it's really interesting because I just happened to pick this up 1 week ago at a sale at the London Public Library. So how fortuitous sometimes, and I've found this over time, of how books have come into my hands in very unusual and timely ways. So this author, Eric Kaufmann, is a scholar. He is affiliated with the University of London in England, but actually was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, and so is a native Canadian, but now living in England. And he writes a fascinating book of some of the trends that have been unfolding in the world towards understanding more about this idea of multiculturalism. And so his book is one of a number that are out there. I have some others with me today as well. One of them is called Multiculturalism, authored primarily by Charles Taylor, a well-known academic. Wrote a book called The Secular Age, for example, and he has a number of other authors that join him in this book on multiculturalism. And then one that we may talk about in a few more minutes when we move to talking about Canada is a book by Neil Basundath, The Cult of Multiculturalism in Canada. So something that hits right at home in our own country with the subject that I'm talking about today. And we'll come back and talk more about that in a few minutes. But I want to talk first of all about the European experience. And there's quite a lot of good commentary and factual data that is generated in Eric Kaufmann's very thorough and extensive book on the subject. So he reminds us of some of the problems that exist with multiculturalism. And so he describes, for example, some of the incidents that we know have unfolded in Europe. In 2005, you might recall the incident of the Danish newspaper publication, Jyllands Posten, that published 12 cartoons entitled The Face of Muhammad, which were viewed by Muslims as being sacrilegious and unleashed a fervor where we saw the unfolding of persons that were murdered and assassinated as a result of that. More recently, we've had the attack against Salman Rushdie, the fiction author. And also, you might recall other episodes. There was the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris in 2015, where two Islamic brothers burst into the French magazine office in Paris of Charlie Hebdo and gunned down a number of people. And so these are just a few of the examples that have occurred. And there are others. Just recently in the newspapers in the last weeks, there was also an incident in France of the killing of a teacher. There was an incident in Belgium of two Swedes that were killed there in a soccer match event that were killed. Also, there have been episodes in Sweden and Denmark and other countries that have occurred as well. So we're finding hugely problematic conflicts unfolding in most European countries focused on this East-West clash, this Islam versus Western civilization conflict that is occurring repeatedly in European states and is becoming very problematic for European governments. And so the notion of multiculturalism and trying to bring the world together in larger international units is finding itself to not be a notion that is working as well as what the elites had hoped. And then Eric Kaufmann also talks about the statistical data that shows how that multiculturalism surprisingly doesn't actually create a more cohesive country, but in fact proves to be divisive. That multiculturalism actually has proven by the conflicts I've referenced and other conflictual circumstances that multiculturalism is more divisive and not a cohesive force in countries. And so this is documented very well and very soundly by Eric Kaufmann. So there are significant problems that unfold with this. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the underlying philosophy and ideology of how this concept of multiculturalism has been promoted and pushed forcefully by academics and elites. One of the most notable ones in that category is a gentleman by the name of Paul Kurtz. And I did talk about Paul Kurtz quite a lot in my own book that I've been referring to on several programs, Now Through a Glass Darkly, Recounting the Human Captivity, that I wrote probably now nearing 30 years ago. And I talked about Paul Kurtz as being one of the founders of a concept called secular humanism. And he wrote about that in a book called The Humanist Manifesto 1. Actually, there was a second volume that followed up later. And so the premises that flow from secular humanism is that mankind evolved. There was no need of invoking God as creating man because man just evolved from the single-celled organisms and eventually through to the present existence, which is a theory scientifically that needs to be vigorously challenged. Darwin's theory of evolution has been allowed unfettered growth by the promotion of secular academics and has not been scrutinized as needs be. And maybe in another program we'll talk more about that. I did speak to that in my book and is something that needs to be further investigated. But on our topic today, I want to speak to you about some of the premises of secular humanism. So it says this: the concept of God was abolished. They write, we are convinced that the time has passed for theism, deism, modernism, and several varieties of new thought. And they reject all standards associated with Christian faith and even religion more generally. And they promote that mankind has to learn to face the crises of life on its own terms, and that mankind, by education and by its just sheer power of rationality, will overcome all the problems of the world. Well, we see that's not working, is it? All the conflict and wars and famine and all of the issues we see happening routinely in our world today are not being conquered. And so the whole idea of the secular humanism manifesto, supported by elites from organizations like UNESCO and United Nations and its affiliates, has proven to be completely ineffectual. And yet this is the same group that's promoting a new world order based on these values, including concepts like multiculturalism. So let me read a little bit. I have actually an obituary for Paul Kurtz here that he died back in 2012. And let me read just a little bit further of some of the concepts that he was promoting. So he says this, in describing the Human Manifesto 2, the second volume that I just mentioned to you. It says, the document was signed by 120 religious leaders, philosophers, scientists, and writers. It argued that the system of world law should transcend the limits of national sovereignty. So there it is. National sovereignty should be transcended, it should be displaced, and the idea is to create a new world order without national boundaries, and the means of effecting that is substantially multiculturalism. So this is not something you will hear in the media typically, and in fact might not hear it at all. So this is something that attention needs to be paid to, because frankly this is a deception that's been promoted to dispose of national sovereignty and to create concepts that really are leading towards the idea of one world government and at least displacing national boundaries and creating international organizations, very much like the European Union and frankly the UN. So in this particular article describing the work of Paul Kurtz, it talks about his agenda for promoting the kinds of secular humanistic values to promote these concepts. And so his goal, signed by, it says, a secular humanist declaration signed by 61 scholars. So again, the academic elite, or the supposed elite, are trying to get rid of what they would consider dogmatic religious principles, and particularly those espoused by a literal viewing of Christianity as described and espoused in the Bible. And his goal, and the goal of those of like mind, is to displace Christianity and to promote ideology that says that mankind only can save the world alone. Only we can save the world by our own means, and we don't need to invoke the idea of God to help us in that area. And so you have to understand these underlying concepts in order to understand what is really happening with the notion of secular humanism and what's happening in the world today. Because then what we've seen is the world has gone on to create its own value system, its own postmodern concepts of how we should govern ourselves and how we should create values. And so I've talked about this in prior programming with this idea of DEI, this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how those concepts have morphed. It used to be called DIE, and it used to have the word equality instead of equity. And these concepts have morphed as the academic elite have tried to instill a new non-Christian value system of morals on our world. And I can tell you it will be unsuccessful, because human created values will not work. And we see that every day in our world, how that the values of mankind are simply not working, and hence we have war and conflict and famine and moral confusion and gender confusion, and all these things that we see unfolding continuously in our world today. So what we're seeing is instead the idea of inclusion, again, that everybody needs to feel included, and I emphasize the word feel included, and this idea of equity and diversity, all derived from Marxist concepts, is being instilled with great haste in corporations and governments and all manner of organizations. And what we're finding, though, is instead it's not healing conflict, and it's not not prescribing pathways out of these difficulties. And so it's creating divisiveness, and it's creating indoctrination, ideological indoctrination. And this is something we need to be so careful of and so cautious. So I hope with this background you have a greater understanding of what is behind the forces of multiculturalism and, frankly, DEI, these morphing concepts that are being flung upon us and promoted very illegitimately and against sound principles that historically we followed. I want to finish off and come back and talk to you in just 1 minute about how it's affecting us here in Canada. I don't want to neglect that subject. So let's take a break just for a moment, and we'll come back and look at the specific case of Canada. Welcome back. I am Phil Cornish, and I'm your host of Cornish Talks Common Sense. We've been talking today about another difficult subject, multiculturalism, and how that's been invoked on the world, and some of the unseen but underlying forces that are promoting it, specifically among academic elites, promoting the idea of secular humanism and a plan that invokes world governance and the diminishing of national boundaries and of nationalism, and using forces such as diversity and equity and inclusion to promote these goals. So we've talked about that in a worldwide context, and I want to turn now to focus on Canada specifically. So let's talk about what is happening in the country of Canada. So what we need to understand is that right now the Liberal Trudeau government has created a policy that has seen Canada having an influx of 500,000 immigrants annually. Over 500,000 immigrants now being admitted to Canada. This is really unheard of in prior Canadian history. The targets for immigration have been greatly elevated by the Trudeau government. And of course there's different ways of looking at this. Some would say, well, we need better skilled laborers in the country that can be brought in by immigrants. But what we're finding is it's not nearly that simple. So what we're finding is that even right now we're finding a housing crisis, which has great economic ramifications for Canadians right now, because the admission of the quantity of immigrants we're allowing per year did not seem to generate the foresight for the Trudeau government to think about the fact there's no housing for them to live in. So this is just one of the simple contradictions that has occurred with the Trudeau government. But it's worse and deeper than that. What we find out, if we again look back historically, is that Justin Trudeau's father really was a primary force towards driving the notion of multiculturalism in Canada. So the apple has not fallen far from the tree. We should not be surprised by this. So what in fact we know is that in 1971, Canada passed the Multiculturalism Act, and a great force behind that was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And that subject is documented somewhat by an author I referred you to earlier, Neil Boonsendath, who is an immigrant himself to Canada. And he writes a book talking about the effort of Canadian government to promote the Multiculturalism Act going forward from 1971 with an attempt to create a greater cultural mosaic of diversity and tolerance. So here's where you see these notions of diversity and equity and inclusion come from. It comes precisely from this language of the Multiculturalism Act. And so this author critiques some of what the Canadian government has done in that regard. And I'm not going to go into extensive detail at all on that today, but just to note that it is out there. I want to instead spend a little bit more time on another book that I had recently located by Eric Kaufman. And I want to just read a few passages that exist in Mr. Kaufman's book. So he raises the issue of whether there is in fact such a thing as Canadian exceptionalism. Are we in fact unique, and do we have an identity as a country? And one identity that historically has occurred in Canada is being part of the British Empire, and so like its fellow countries in what we call the Five Eyes group of international cooperation among parties of a common interest, we see the countries of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States being, like Canada, a country that saw its germination in the British Empire. And so historically, Canada's identity has largely grown from that. But we see how that is being washed away, and how that is being diminished and really displaced with the growth of the multiculturalism movement. And so Kaufman takes up that subject, and we need to understand how that arose and what the effect of it has been. Kaufman quotes, for example, the following. He says, "The crisis of Canadian identity didn't mean Anglo-Canadians suddenly welcomed diversity, far from it." He says, "A majority of Canadians opposed immigration from outside Europe in a 1961 poll. However, the collapse of the loyalist tradition has created a vacuum which opened the way for left modernism to emerge triumphant among Anglo-Canadian elites. In the guise of multiculturalism, it shaped the country's new national identity." He talks about 1996, the term being coined by Frank Underhill, a Canadian historian who has promoted some socialistic values and anti-imperial values that have taken Canada away from its origin. And then through Pierre Trudeau and his prime ministership in the 1970s, how immigration policy drastically shifted towards this left modernist direction, ultimately culminating, as I've said, in the 1971 Multiculturalism Act, making Canada a multiculturalism country. And maybe you didn't even appreciate that statute exists, and in fact that is a direction that has been strongly promoted on us by governmental elites. And we see some interesting further data on that I'll read another passage that I want to point to on that subject matter, where Mr. Kaufman says the following. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has sought to exemplify the left modernist mission of Canadian identity, ran into the same contradiction on a trip to India, where his repeated attempt to signal his cosmopolitanism by dressing in Indian attire drew charges of cultural appropriation. So you might remember that story where Prime Minister Trudeau went to India and dressed up in their garb, seeking to belong and espouse this multicultural idea that he has, actually created a backfire that caused greater concern than it did good. And it's important to note that Kaufman concludes, drawing on the studies of many historians and social scientists, that multiculturalism has the effect of causing greater divisiveness and not promoting cohesion, but actually the opposite of that. So the promotion, as has been done by Canadian governments, has perhaps not served Canadians as well as had been contemplated, and in fact is instilling and generating greater divisiveness and conflict. And we see this in Canada unfolding in various ways. You might recall the Air India crash, the Flight 182 near Ireland in 1985, and then the recent assassination of a Sikh leader, Hardeep Nijal, on June 18th of this year in British Columbia, and also honor killings that occur from time to time, and attempts to introduce Sharia law. So what we see is that in Canada, immigrants bring their prior national issues with them to Canada. And so unfortunately has generated discord and disharmony and created conflict because of the baggage of ethnic issues that have been brought into Canada and have created problems. So we cannot be unalert to these issues. We cannot ignore the reality of science and data that exists that describes the dangers that exist with multiculturalism and in fact could create the undoing of our country and of the nationalist identity that it has. So I hope these concepts, which may be foreign and new to you, have been brought to light in a way that perhaps you'll look at the subject in a new way, that we need to proceed with great care as we move forward with a Canadian identity. Thanks for listening today. I hope you've had your eyes open to a subject that is not talked about much in our normal media today.